Oferta rusa.
Russian offer. Russian President Vladimir Putin made a truly unexpected peace proposal. During a visit to Kyrgyzstan, Putin stated that Russia will completely cease hostilities if Ukrainian troops withdraw from the occupied territories. However, Putin also made a clarification. If the Ukrainians do not withdraw, then Russia will militarily conquer the occupied territories. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning from Berlin, Germany. We begin broadcast number 284 of Demolishing Myths, live. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to help us with a thumbs up against censorship, as well as through subscriptions, memberships, and our PayPal account. So much information, so many updates, so many truly fundamental statements for this broadcast. That's why the delay in starting. Until very recently, Russian President Vladimir Putin was on an official visit to Kyrgyzstan, specifically in the capital city Bishkek. There, Putin held a long press conference today with an initial statement, followed by an open session, answering journalists' questions for a very long time. Throughout this conference, Putin made crucial, highly significant statements, not only regarding the war in Ukraine, but also about the relationship between Russia and the United States, Russia and Europe, Russia and the nuclear arms race, among many other things. Many, many key definitions.
Muchas, pero muchas definiciones, no vamos a poder presentarlas todas hoy.
We won't be able to present all of them today, such is the number of Putin's key statements, but we will be able to focus on some of them. And by the way, on the most important ones. In the meantime, we can start by putting this into context with images of the city of Bishkek, for example, the capital of the Republic of Kyrgyzstan, a country often forgotten and little known both in Europe and Latin America, yet of fundamental geopolitical importance. Largely because of its location, Kyrgyzstan lies precisely between China and Russia, no more, no less. Moreover, it not only takes part in the modern Silk Road, in the Belt and Road Initiative as the Chinese call it, but even historically, Kyrgyzstan appeared on the original Silk Road, the ancient route of Marco Polo. That is the fundamental importance of Kyrgyzstan, a country that became independent after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But before that, remember that Kyrgyzstan was part of the Soviet Socialist Republics. And take a look at that mosque, truly spectacular. A country, moreover, located at the crossroads of different civilizations, Chinese, Russian, Muslim, well, with two official languages, Russian and Kyrgyz. A truly fascinating country. And Putin, from the day before yesterday until today, made an official visit, because precisely in Kyrgyzstan, pay attention to the footage of his arrival, because they welcomed him with honors, not just honors, something truly spectacular. The reason for Putin's visit was the summit of the Collective Security Treaty Organization in Kyrgyzstan, no less. An organization, by the way, that is the successor of none other than the Warsaw Pact. Remember that. An eagle waiting for him, waiting for Putin. There, apparently, falconry represents an important activity. The Kyrgyz president himself, Sadir Japarov. Falconry, apparently, is a very significant practice within Kyrgyzstan. And Putin, by the way, landed in Bishkek to take part in the summit of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which once again presents itself as the successor to the Warsaw Pact, established in response to the creation of NATO as a defensive organization during the Cold War.
Defensiva durante los tiempos de la Guerra Fría. Atención, por ahí un soldado.
Attention. Over there, a soldier. Well, here it is, a concert. Over there, a soldier, a knight dressed in armor on a horse, something crazy. And this is just the arrival. Well, there with Russian music, with traditional Kyrgyz instruments. Well, logically, once the Soviet Union disappeared, the Warsaw Pact, that military pact among the countries located east of the so-called Iron Curtain, east of the Berlin Wall, in a way, a defensive pact, as a consequence of the establishment of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, supposedly defensive as well, but with an increasingly evident offensive nature, at least from '89 onward, of this organization. Well, it was the Soviets and all the European countries of socialism, of the truly existing socialist bloc.
Del socialismo realmente existente, establecieron el Pacto de Varsovia. Ese pacto desapareció con...
They established the Warsaw Pact. That pact disappeared with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but shortly afterward they created another security organization, once again known as the Collective Security Treaty, in which, in addition to Russia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Belarus, Tajikistan, and Serbia also participate. All of them, except for Serbia, which was part of Yugoslavia at the time and joined this organization later, in 2013, not at its founding in 1994, were part of the Soviet Union. In addition, remember that this organization, and we can also show the map, simply taken from Wikipedia, has significant geopolitical importance as a defensive organization.
La importancia geopolítica de esta organización defensiva. Además, esta organización aparece como...
Moreover, this organization appears as the heart of an even larger economic and military structure, known as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in which not only Russia and the former Soviet republics participate, but also China, and increasingly, India itself. It is, in a way, a counter-block to NATO. I'm just providing a bit of context about the importance of this summit, and precisely because of this summit, Putin arrived there to take part in it.
Putin desembarcó ahí para participar en ella. Las declaraciones de Putin respecto a la cumbre y a la seguridad de...
Putin's statements regarding the summit and the security of the entire bloc will likely be presented tomorrow, because today we're going to analyze the remarks he made at a conference held just a few minutes ago, independently. In addition to all his interventions at the summit, many of his official speeches, and several exchanges with journalists there, today, before his departure, the Russians decided that for some reason they would hold an independent press conference on various matters, and it's still causing, this conference, not this video but the other one, my apologies, it's still causing a stir here. Now then, Putin's entrance to the conference continues to make waves globally due to the magnitude of his statements.
Por la magnitud de las declaraciones, el contexto, un nutrido grupo.
Here's the context. A large group of journalists, an aesthetic very reminiscent of Soviet times but from Kyrgyzstan, mixed with that particular kind of Orientalism typical of this region. And among other things, among other definitions, he also presented a peace proposal, no more, no less. This is currently making waves on a global scale. So let's begin by analyzing some of Putin's statements at this conference.
Putin en esta conferencia, quizás para mí la más importante de todas, la de...
Perhaps, for me, the most important of all, the possibility of ending hostilities, precisely in a context of great uncertainty, following the unexpected presentation of US President Donald Trump's peace plan. The famous 28-point plan unexpectedly unveiled by the White House, after which public negotiations began between the United States and Ukraine, without Europe's participation. Even though, according to the Europeans, they were supposed to take part, and in fact did, in that joint conference and those negotiations, only two flags were visible, that of the United States and that of Ukraine, leaving the Europeans sidelined.
fueron rechazados los europeos. En Génova, estas negociaciones, tras la presentación del plan de
In
paz,
Genoa, these negotiations, following the presentation of the peace plan, after that, the Ukrainians seemed happy about the supposed modification of those 28 points, reduced to 19, and with all the concessions to Russia included in that Trump peace plan, which basically was less a peace plan than a declaration of the terms of Ukraine's surrender. And I would add to this the surrender of NATO, because here not only will Ukraine and the European Union capitulate, but Ukraine, the European Union, and NATO, including the United States, will capitulate, with the exception of that gentleman's agreement between Trump and Putin. An agreement evidently reached in Alaska at their meeting in Anchorage, after which the United States withdraws from the war against Russia, disguised as a mediator, as if it had not capitulated, even though in reality it leaves the war because the war seems lost.
Abandona la guerra porque la guerra parece perdida. Comenzaron una guerra de expansión contra Rusia.
They started a war of expansion against Russia, and the Americans, along with all of NATO, appear as losers. They capitulate. But well, Putin validated this, that the United States modestly stepped back from its role as mediator, disguising that defeat, as long as it stops being the sponsor of this war and creates the conditions for its end.
Y entonces genere las condiciones para su final. Es el acuerdo de caballeros entre Putin y Trump. El contexto.
It's the gentleman's agreement between Putin and Trump. That's the general context. And then, after Trump's plan was presented, the negotiations in Genoa with Yermak, accused of corruption, Yermak, Zelensky's right-hand man, took place. The Ukrainians seemed happy, because supposedly, in those days, they were going to make a trip to the United States. Zelensky himself would travel to the United States to determine the final details of this new peace plan, in which they abandoned the conditions of Ukraine's capitulation. And suddenly, a post by Trump on Truth Social, his network, sparked a soap opera of tears and sobs in Ukraine.
Sollozos en Ucrania si de repente Trump determinó, según su propia publicación.
Suddenly, Trump decided, according to his own post on Truth Social, that he would not hold a meeting with Zelensky in Washington to establish the details of this new peace plan, which was more favorable to Ukraine. Instead, he chose to send his representatives to both Kiev and Moscow for the signing of something much closer to the original peace plan, or at least for its negotiation. In the midst of all this, a real soap opera. Back and forths, gossip, and contradictions. Everyone, even Western media, describes this peace plan as a capitulation, yet versions continue to proliferate about changes, reluctant acceptances, and what is or isn't included in this peace plan. And in that context, now we resume the analysis of Putin's words. Putin made this statement about the relationship with the United States, with NATO, with Europe, and the possibility of ending Russian hostilities on other terms, on the terms set by Russia. Pay attention to the statements. When asked about the relationship with the G8 countries, remember the Western countries, basically with the United States at the forefront, he replied, "Keep in mind that even before the tragic events in Ukraine began, I had stopped traveling to the G8 countries. Didn't you notice?" When the events in Ukraine began, we were told, "We don't want you here," at the G7 meetings. G8 with Russia, G7 without Russia. Well, good thing. I don't quite remember who said that. I think it was the head of government once. I'm not making this up. The first time I refused to participate was because it happened to coincide with the formation of the Russian government after the presidential elections. I think it was in 2012. But we never rejected contact. We're always open to interaction. First of all, no one invites us now. I haven't heard or received any official proposal. Secondly, we know that the overwhelming majority of the participants in this group, the so-called G7, as I've already said, I don't quite understand why they're called the Seven Greats, since, in terms of territory, population, and contribution to global GDP, they are becoming less and less significant. Well, this, in Putin's words, is a joke, a tease, a real slap in the face. He, always very formal, says, why do they call them the Seven Greats, the G7, if in economic, population, and territorial terms they are becoming less and less significant? That's a direct quote from the transcript of his speech. Anyway, a bit more about Putin. However, this doesn't really matter to us. They remain important partners for us. In the current situation, I can't quite imagine how we would interact directly with them. Can you imagine it? Let's imagine we arrive at the G7, greet each other at the meeting, and then what? Do we look each other in the eye and frown? Maybe, if we implement all the proposals we received from the list provided by the US administration, the 28-point peace plan, the conditions might be created for bilateral or multilateral contacts with these countries. But it's too early to talk about that. And now, attention. We continue to receive proposals for a ceasefire on one front or another. When Ukrainian troops leave the territories they occupy, Russian hostilities will cease. However, if they do not leave, we will achieve it by military means. I repeat, because of the importance of the offer, and also of the final words, we continue to receive proposals for a ceasefire on one front or another. When Ukrainian troops leave the territories they occupy, hostilities will cease. If they do not leave, we will achieve it by military means.
This is evidently the moment of the phrase.
They're there, obviously. I, without knowing Russian, only with a transcription, can't determine exactly at what point in this little piece, in this fragment, that phrase appears, but it's clearly at the end. Here, with Putin's gestures quite clear. If they abandon the occupied territories, and Putin defines as occupied territories those that have already been declared constitutionally as integral parts of Russia. Not only Donetsk, Luhansk and Crimea, of course, but also Kherson and Zaporizhia entirely. If they abandon those, according to Putin, the war and hostilities will end. If not, they will conquer them militarily. Just like that. Hello Putin, poker face, sober.
Aló Putin, cara de póker, sobrio, ¿sí? Mientras tanto, las tropas rusas realizan avances.
Meanwhile, Russian troops are making increasingly larger and faster advances. By the way, going back again to the context of these words, and to the negotiations, the back and forth, the gossip and disputes about Trump's peace plan, apparently Trump's new envoy to Ukraine, this man known as Driscoll, who has a military background, is replacing none other than Keith Kellogg, also a former military officer but older, a fierce anti-Russian, strongly pro-Ukrainian, one of the neoconservative hawks in Trump's administration, who so far seems to have only taken part in the negotiations between Russia, the United States, and Ukraine, as the US envoy in Ukraine.
Como emisario de Estados Unidos en Ucrania, básicamente como un propagandista pro-Ucraniano.
Basically, like a pro-Ukrainian propagandist and nothing more. That's why Trump, after his appointment, didn't assign him the task of establishing dialogue with Putin or making trips to Moscow. For that, he called on his personal friend, Steve Witkoff, a man apparently of goodwill, though without the slightest idea of geopolitics, diplomacy, military affairs, of anything, a real estate businessman from Miami. But this man managed to build a very good personal relationship with Putin during his, I can't remember if it was 5 or 6, visits to Moscow for direct contacts and conversations with Putin, one of them lasting several hours, conducted in a manner that was not only unorthodox, but also rather undiplomatic. In some of those meetings, he didn't even have a translator, and was basically at the mercy of the Russian translators, which, well, obviously meant that the Russian translators would surely provide a translation faithful to Putin's words.
Fiel a las palabras de Putin. Acá Putin no quiere cometer, no quiere capitalizar.
Here, Putin doesn't want to take advantage of this lack of professionalism, but a diplomat should always be accompanied by their own absolutely trusted interpreter, in order to determine, from their own interpreter's mouth, the meaning and sense of the other party's words, the one they're negotiating with. Vitkov landed there practically alone, aside from his security escort, and then basically began a dialogue with Putin's interpreter only, male or female, depending on the moment.
Con el traductor de Putin, nada más, traductor o traductora, según el momento. Bueno, una muestra de la falta de conocimiento del asunto.
Well, it shows a lack of understanding of the issue. But at least this man, apparently due to his relationship with Trump, created a direct channel without the mediation of the neoconservative hawks in between, such as Keith Kellogg, the US envoy, the American emissary to Ukraine, officially designated as such, but backed by Trump. And now, Trump has directly decided to remove Keith Kellogg from this role and has sent this man Driscoll, a new emissary, who apparently holds a much less fanatical stance against the Russians and a much more realistic one. And this Mr. Driscoll, and here I'm picking up the argument, I didn't drop it. This Mr. Driscoll, in the meetings so far with the Ukrainians, already last week, just before the presentation of Trump's 28-point plan, and now in this second meeting for negotiations, made it clear, according to all reports, that Ukraine appeared to be on the verge of military collapse. He presented it that way in his meetings with Yermak, and apparently in his meetings with Zelensky himself. He issued this warning: validate this plan, don't reject all these attempts of little lies. In reality, don't reject this capitulation disguised as a peace plan, because you appear to be on the brink of military defeat, right? These are Driscoll's words, according to reports from US media outlets, both anti-Russian and pro-Ukrainian, right?
Estadounidenses, antirrusos y pro-ucranianos, ¿sí? Insospechados de simpatías por Putin.
Not suspected of sympathies for Putin, which means, obviously, that everyone is already aware of how unsustainable the military situation is for Ukraine, and rejecting this can only be explained by the warmongering fanaticism of the war's promoters, and by Zelensky's own personal situation. Remember that the end of the war will determine for him not only the end of his political career, the end of his presidency. Trump's plan, moreover, set 100 days for holding elections, but could also determine his physical disappearance, because nobody wants Zelensky right now. The Ukrainians don't want him, logically the Russians don't want him, and he holds too many secrets, which would make him an easy target for British or US intelligence services.
Para los servicios de inteligencia británicos o estadounidenses, ¿sí? Muchas ventanas abiertas,
many open windows, many banana peels lying around, possible slips, falls from balconies, a stumble, and a fall from some skyscraper window. Well, the usual way of silencing those who were at some point useful idiots in the service of the United States or even the United Kingdom, and then their elimination. That's why Zelensky still rejects this and persists in rejecting all these plans. Speaking of the plans, precisely, and about Europe, Putin also made statements at this conference. We present them below. Let's lower the volume a little here.
Por aquí, un poquito menos de volumen. Acomodamos esto y ahora.
Let's get this sorted. And now, yes.
Bien. Las palabras de Putin textuales. Hablando sobre
Putin's exact words. Speaking about the draft agreement. In fact, at the beginning, it didn't exist. A series of questions were proposed for discussion and later formulation. As I've mentioned many times, we discussed this with the US negotiators before my visit to the United States and my trip to Alaska. Later, a list of 28 possible agreement points was distributed, the famous peace plan. As I've already stated publicly, it was passed to us through certain channels, and we became familiar with it. Then negotiations took place in Geneva between the US and Ukrainian delegations, and as I understand it, they decided to divide those 28 points into 4 separate components. Then, all of this was conveyed to us. We agreed that it could serve as a basis for future agreements. However, it would not be appropriate for me to speak about definitive options at this stage, since none exist. Some of the issues are fundamental in nature, Overall, we see that the US side is taking our position into account, both before and after the talks in Anchorage, Alaska. There are certain matters that absolutely need to be discussed very seriously. We need to express everything in diplomatic language. Because, for example, it's one thing to claim that Russia has no intention of attacking Europe, which seems absurd to us, since we have never had any intention of doing so. But if they want to hear it from us, let it be on record. Without asking questions, I believe there are some rather unhinged or dishonest people trying to take advantage of this. Because when they publicly tell their citizens that Russia is preparing to attack Europe and claim that we need to strengthen our defenses immediately, they either benefit the defense industry and private companies, or it's a way to boost their own domestic political popularity, especially given the serious state of the economy and the social sphere. This, obviously, is about Europe. It's hard to say what drives them, but from our perspective, it's complete nonsense, pure lies. However, if this narrative is spreading in public consciousness, if they have frightened their citizens and want assurances that we have no aggressive plans for Europe, we will gladly make that clear. Perhaps it makes sense, if we want to talk and debate together, to address some of the issues related to European security. In fact, we ourselves once suggested it. And our Western partners, let's call them that again, are willing. We are ready. We understand the need for serious discussions, where every word matters. For example, one of the documents mentions that we must resolve the issue of strategic stability together with our American counterparts. But for God's sake, do you really think we're opposed to this? This is what we proposed from the very beginning, and we even suggested that the Obama administration negotiate certain issues. We heard yes, 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 but then, just a month before Obama left office, everything stalled. Now we're approaching the end of another treaty, the Nuclear START 3, which expires in February. If they don't want to move forward, that's fine, but from these documents we can see there's a general desire to review these matters. Each one is a complex and serious issue. Without a doubt, we're ready for meaningful talks. The US delegation was scheduled to arrive in Moscow last week.
Clearer than this, impossible.
That even now, in European media, and in Western media in general, including the American press, they keep hammering away at the absurd idea that Russia wants to start an invasion against Europe, and at the madness that the Russians are on the verge of launching an imminent attack on the continent. The German war minister himself said, in 2029 we will start a war with Russia. A few months ago, American generals, here in Wiesbaden, Germany, during a conference at a military congress, stated that in the event of a confrontation, they would imminently seize Kaliningrad. No consequences for those terrible words from a sitting American general. Well, depending on the degree of madness among European leaders, they keep setting different dates for a supposed direct confrontation with Russia. Among some, I've heard 2030, 2029, the German war minister said 2029, and I've even heard 2027, meaning in 2 years. Well, crazy things like that, said offhand, just like nothing. And here Putin responds to this. This whole narrative represents complete nonsense, total and absolute stupidity. We never wanted, do not want, and will not want the invasion of Europe. And if they want us to put it in writing, we will. But for that, logically, we must begin serious negotiations about European security, in diplomatic and formal terms, not through statements on Twitter. Putin's words couldn't be clearer.
Clarísimas las palabras de Putin. Más allá de la obviedad.
Beyond the obvious, we've emphasized this 1,000 times. Even if someone dislikes Putin, sees him as a liar, a manipulator, a distorter, all of that actually represents a manipulation strategy to launch an invasion against an unsuspecting Europe? Well, let's think critically for a second about the possible goals of something as delusional as a Russian invasion of Europe. What could Russia want from Europe? Territory? Russia, of all countries, which spans 12 time zones from end to end. 12 time zones. When it's morning on one side, it's already night on the other, right? The country with the largest territory in the world. Could it want natural resources? Russia, of all places. Oil, gas, minerals, rare earths. Is Russia going to want Europe's territory or natural resources? What natural resources? What natural resources? Here we have nothing but more Macrons, Starmers, and Merseys growing. More than resources. Natural waste. Stupidity. Now, not because they love Europe, but because they want European companies, the European economy. What economy? This economy in accelerated decline, in total crisis, in a full-speed process of deindustrialization. Is that what Russia would want? An economy that, by the way, now ranks fourth, ahead of Germany. Something that had never happened before. Yes, something that had never happened before. The Russian economy, according to the International Monetary Fund itself, is now larger in size and scale than the German economy. In first place, China, beyond dispute. In second, the United States, still, but clearly in decline, with many economic, political, and other problems. Then comes India, another BRICS country, and fourth, also from the BRICS, Russia. So, what the hell would Russia want? Invade Europe? What nonsense. Please think for a second before saying such stupid things. And this, moreover, with Putin saying in front of the cameras himself, and I don't want to misquote here, the rhetoric that Russia intends to attack Europe seems completely absurd to us. We have never had any intention of doing so. Once again, they publicly tell their citizens that Russia is preparing to attack Europe and claim they need to strengthen their defenses immediately. For what purpose? Either to benefit the defense industry and private companies, Putin's words, the big business of European leaders with this rhetoric about an imminent Russian invasion, or it's a way to boost their own domestic political popularity, especially given the serious state of Europe's economy and social sphere. Exactly that. It's hard to say what drives them in all this, Putin's exact words, but from our perspective, it's complete nonsense. Putin's words, pure lies. If this narrative is spreading in public consciousness, it's because they've frightened their citizens and want assurances that we have no aggressive plans for Europe. We'll be happy to clarify it. It might make sense if we want to talk and debate it all together and address some issues related to European security. In fact, we ourselves suggested it. For a long time, Russia has wanted to discuss all these matters connected, among other things, not only to European and Eurasian security, but also to global security, through negotiations on nuclear arms agreements. And here, remember, we wanted to negotiate with Obama on these issues. They replied, yes, 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 and just a month before Obama left office, they stalled everything. And now it seems, according to Putin himself, and this is objectively true, that we're just a few months away from the expiration of the last treaty on nuclear arms limitation, and suddenly there's interest in renegotiating it. And Putin responds, we've wanted to renegotiate and extend this for a long time, so who abandoned the nuclear agreements? The United States did. And Putin doesn't make this clear here. He doesn't mention the decisions made by Trump, either in this administration or the previous one, because he wants a good relationship for the negotiation. But the unilateral withdrawal of the United States from the treaties did begin with Bush Jr. Yes, that's true, but no president actually abandoned them. They abandoned treaties like the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the ABM, under Bush. Later, they abandoned treaties under Obama, and they also did so unilaterally under Trump, during Trump's first administration. They even abandoned the famous Intermediate-Range Missile Treaty, the so-called Euromissiles Treaty, because with that range of missiles, not only nuclear, but also conventional, ballistic, and intercontinental, it was a fundamental treaty for Europe. The United States abandoned it, and it expired as a result. With those intermediate-range missiles, neither Russia can carry out an attack on the United States, nor the United States on Russia, because they have a range of up to 5,500 kilometers. That's why they're called Euromissiles. Missiles from the Cold War era with just the right range to destroy Europe. Either from one side, from Russia toward Europe, the Soviet Union at the time, or from the other, from the United States toward Europe, in the hypothetical case during the Cold War of a Soviet advance into Europe. These are the delusions of the Cold War. Who abandoned that? Franco. And the rest of the treaties now, since Trump came to power as well. And the statement, well, we don't want to renegotiate the last treaty still in force, Start 3. And now, yes, we do want this renegotiation. And Putin responds very clearly here. We've wanted it for 20 years, guys. Well, even though all these things have been said so plainly, publicly, they still keep hammering on and on in the Western media. Well, in Latin American media too, of course, right? Basically, they just pick up the headlines from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and so on, all the major outlets, the BBC, Deutsche Welle, RAI, etc., etc., and they present them over there too, right? The same thing. Well, more statements from Putin. That's how I started this broadcast.
Comencé así esta transmisión. Putin presentó en esta declaración, en esta conferencia.
In this statement, in this press conference, Putin presented fundamental definitions, not only about the possibility of ending Russian hostilities, with a proposal, abandon those territories, and Russian hostilities will immediately cease. He also issued a warning, if you don't abandon them, we will conquer them militarily. But in addition, he recapped everything that happened regarding the so-called Trump peace plan. In fact, in our reconstruction, naturally without knowing the details and back and forth behind this peace plan, when in recent days we presented our reconstruction of those twists and turns, we basically summarized it just like that, without knowing what had actually happened. But well, evidently, we've been following events with our analysis quite accurately. And in the end, this about the negotiation, well, about the Europeans' madness in accusing Russia of an imminent attack, and the obvious fact that Russia wants to negotiate all security agreements, including nuclear ones.
Negociación de todos los acuerdos de seguridad, incluidos los nucleares. Definición tras definición. Y acá una más y atención.
Definition after definition. And here's another one, and pay attention, because here it will establish in black and white the legitimacy of the Ukrainian leaders, the legitimacy of Zelensky, and the fact that any agreement with Zelensky actually lacks legal basis because Zelensky's mandate expired a long time ago, right? Basically, he remains in power under martial law as a dictator, elected at one point, his term has already expired, and without holding new elections, he basically acts as a dictator under martial law, repressing not only pro-Russians, but also part of the anti-Russian Ukrainian opposition, and with one corruption scandal after another. Here are Putin's words on this situation.
De Putin sobre esta situación. Atención.
Attention.
Firmar documentos con los líderes ucranianos.
Signing documents with Ukrainian leaders is useless. I have spoken about this topic many times. I believe the Ukrainian leaders made a fundamental strategic mistake by fearing the holding of presidential elections, after which the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, lost his legitimate status. Russia is also in a state of armed conflict with Ukraine, but we hold elections anyway. Presidential elections, and recently, elections for municipal and regional authorities. We're doing all this, but for some reason they are not. As soon as any kind of peace agreements are signed and hostilities cease, it is necessary to immediately end the actions of the imposed martial law. If martial law is lifted, elections must be announced immediately. Under the current circumstances, it's difficult for Ukraine's political leaders to expect a victory without manipulation or fraud. I think it's almost impossible. Although, of course, as Joseph Stalin said, it's not about who votes, but who counts the votes. The administrative resources are still there, but it's going to be very difficult for them. Then a referendum should be held on all territorial matters. This is established in the Constitution. After that, the referendum must be confirmed by the Constitutional Court. What's happening with the Ukrainian Constitutional Court? I've already spoken about this as well. Let me remind you that when the political leaders asked the Constitutional Court to confirm the president's authority, it opposed it. You see, they avoided giving an answer because the Constitution specifies only one presidential term of 5 years.
And that's where it ends.
There is no provision for an extension. These details can be analyzed, all those legal nuances, but there is no provision for an extension, not even under martial law. Only the Supreme Rada has the right to extend its mandate in wartime. Something that's been said on this channel 1,000 times, by the way. The president cannot, no, he cannot extend his mandate. Therefore, he himself, as an official, cannot sign a peace treaty. Then confirmation from the Constitutional Court is required. But when the Constitutional Court was asked to confirm the powers, the court refused. Do you know what they did? I don't remember if I mentioned this, but it's curious. The security service prevented the former president of the Constitutional Court from entering his workplace. He arrived at work, knocked on the door, and was told, "Get out of here." He eventually fled abroad. The Constitutional Court was not functioning. The President of the Supreme Court is in prison for corruption. Those involved in corruption, the most corrupt officials, imprisoned the President of the Supreme Court for corruption. During this time, the terms of the members of the Constitutional Court expired. It is necessary to elect new members of the Constitutional Court. It's quite a procedure. As soon as martial law is lifted, presidential elections, a referendum, and the formation of a new Constitutional Court must take place. It's an endless process.
Es un proceso interminable, así que, en última instancia, por supuesto, queremos llegar a una...
So ultimately, of course, we want to reach an agreement with Ukraine, but right now it's practically impossible, legally impossible. Anyone who can and wants to, on their own, may carry out negotiations. We need our decisions to be internationally recognized by the main global actors. That's all. This is important because it's one thing for decisions to be recognized and, for example, for certain territories to be under Russian sovereignty, and in the event of a violation of the agreement, it would be considered an attack on the Russian Federation, with all the resulting Russian countermeasures, or it would be seen as an attempt to reclaim legally held Ukrainian territory. These are different things, and therefore we need recognition, but not from the current Ukraine. I hope that in the future we can reach an agreement with Ukraine. There are many sensible people there who want to build relations with Russia from a long-term historical perspective. Couldn't be clearer, and with a great deal of understanding.
Además con muchísimo conocimiento. Yo sinceramente esto de la respuesta...
Honestly, this whole thing about the Constitutional Court's ambivalent response, rejecting, or if not rejecting, at least not validating the extension of Zelensky's mandate, honestly, I didn't remember that. Indeed, the Ukrainian constitution allows, in the case of martial law, for the extension of the mandate of the Rada, the Chamber of Deputies, and basically the legislative branch, but not the executive branch. However, Zelensky decreed the extension of his own mandate, which expired some time ago, and naturally did not hold elections. And as Putin rightly emphasizes, if elections were held, obviously Zelensky and his clique would count the votes of their relatives and the buddies involved in their shady deals and corruption. Nothing more than that. They wouldn't even reach 5%. Unless, There I recall a very good phrase from Stalin. What matters is not the votes, but who counts the votes.
Lo que importa son los que cuentan los votos. Y sí, a menos que cometan fraude.
And yes, unless they commit fraud. But also, apparently, the members of the Supreme Court seem either exiled or imprisoned for corruption, precisely by the same Ukrainian corrupt officials, accused of everything, and already with clear evidence of corruption schemes worth billions of dollars. Well, those were the ones who determined the imprisonment of the Supreme Court, which should be the one to determine the validity or not of Zelensky's authority. Well, all this is important, because if not, all the potential agreements signed, by whom? Who legally represents Ukraine? Who represents Ukraine in signing a document that should determine in the future whether Ukraine can or cannot start a war again against Russia in the name of a little piece of paper? Here it says that Russia represents sovereign power in this territory. But, as it's stated here, since the signature of an illegitimate representative of Ukraine appears here, then those Russian territories do not actually represent Ukrainian territories, legally Ukrainian. We can start the war. That's the importance of the legitimacy of those who sign, of those who validate a document, whether they truly represent a state or not, or whether they do not represent it legitimately and legally. Well, so many definitions, so many of Putin's definitions. And here's the last one. This is right afterward. Putin must have great endurance for so much non-stop exposure to the press. Here, an interview with a Kyrgyz journalist. Here, a bit later, starting around minute 4, more or less. Here, if I remember correctly.
Aquí, si no recuerdo mal.
Indeed, it's already full. Here comes the journalist's question.
La periodista. En los últimos años se ha hablado en la Federación Rusa de que
In recent years, there has been talk in the Russian Federation that the Russian economy is turning toward the east. In fact, trade with Asian countries, particularly with Kyrgyzstan, is growing. But sooner or later, the conflict in Ukraine will end. Is it possible for the Russian economy to return to the European Union if sanctions are lifted? And Putin responds, attention, I hope the conflict in Ukraine ends. You just said sooner or later. Well, for me, the sooner, the better. However, this will only happen if we achieve the objectives of the special military operation. But the issue is not that we are making some kind of strategic shift in relation to the events in Ukraine.
Estratégico en relación con los acontecimientos en Ucrania desde la década de 2000, como dicho muchas veces.
Since the 2000s, as I've said many times, we've begun to pay more attention to this aspect of our cooperation. Not because we've had problems with our European partners, but because the economies of countries in the East and the global South are developing at a faster pace than those of Western countries. Well, that's an understandable argument. Now, obviously, the war in Ukraine served as a catalyst for these changes, and for this shift of Russia and the world toward Asia. Yes, of course, Russia had already begun to move closer to China, India, the BRICS, the global South, and the Eastern countries.
A los BRICS, al sur global, a los países del este. Sí, lo había comenzado en 2000, efectivamente. Todo esto es cierto.
Yes, he had started it in 2000, indeed. All of that is true. But the war in Ukraine, and therefore the immediate interruption of the energy and economic relationship with Europe and the United States, though not entirely, because remember that Europeans are still buying Russian fuel to this day, and not just the Hungarians and Slovaks who lack access to the sea and therefore cannot give up Russian energy. But also the most important and well-known European countries continue to buy Russian gas, oil, and already refined fuel through intermediaries, basically at a much higher price.
A través de intermediarios, básicamente a un precio muchísimo mayor. ¿Sí? ¿Por qué? Porque no puede desaparecer un...
Why? Because a supplier, a provider of such a fundamental fuel for Europe, cannot just disappear overnight. Europeans lack other sources, not by choice, but because those fuels simply don't exist elsewhere. Even so, logically, the economic relationship between Europe and Russia has come to a halt, a noticeable interruption since the beginning of the war. And obviously, that sped up Russia's turn toward Asia and the BRICS. Very diplomatically, Putin responds, "No, this had started earlier." Yes, true. But the war accelerated all of this and sped up a lot of other things as well.
Aceleró todo esto y aceleró un montón de cosas. Aceleró por sobre todas las cosas el comienzo.
Above all else, it accelerated the beginning of the end. It sped up the crisis, the collapse of the old world order, and the rise of a new world order with China at the forefront. Now an unstoppable locomotive, and no longer just in economic terms, but also in political and military ones. That's why these alliances among all these countries exist. Economic, yes. All the Russian energy once sold to Europe is now sold to China, India, Iran, the eastern countries, and through them to the rest of the world, but also through political cooperation, the visits, the meetings among the heads of state of Russia, China, India, South Africa, Brazil with Lula, Iran, and so on, and so on, and so on.
Iraníes, etcétera, etcétera, etcétera. Y militar también, porque esto está generando cooperación militar.
And military as well, because this is generating military cooperation throughout this new world. Toward the end, demolishers, men and women. And by the way, how are we doing with likes? How are we? How are we? How are we? Almost 2,000 demolishers connected and 1,000 likes. Demolishers, please help us fight censorship with a click on the little hand, the thumbs up, please. In contrast to this, to the clarity and the multiplicity of definitions, things said bluntly, very clearly, it also addresses two very important issues. Agreements related to nuclear weapons, European security, well, Zelensky, the possible signing of peace agreements with Ukraine, the possibility of a ceasefire if the Ukrainians retreat, what happened regarding the 28 US peace points, the Europeans' madness over the imminent Russian invasion.
La locura de los europeos sobre la invasión rusa inminente. Bueno, además de todas estas.
Well, in addition to all these things said openly, topics addressed without filters and very clearly. Well, the counterpart, basically in Europe, the European leaders. And here the latest example of this. Yes, 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 yes. With you, not only one of the most anti-Russian, Russophobic, belligerent, furious, and radical of them all, but also one of the dumbest. Sorry, I take no pleasure in describing a woman as dumb. It's unbecoming of me. But this lady is dumb, unfortunately. That's the reality. A dumb woman, uneducated, yes, foolish. That's the reality, unfortunately.
Atención a la ya no barbaridad, la
Pay attention to the, not barbarity anymore, but stupidity, said by this lady yesterday, because on top of that she was talking nonsense. Well, I'll show it. I'll show it. We had already shown the first part of this speech, of this address yesterday. It began with a bunch of stupid remarks saying, "We cannot abandon support for Ukraine. We must reject Trump's peace deal. We want peace, but only peace after the destruction of Russia." At one point later on, I don't remember if we showed that or not, regarding one of the points in Trump's peace plan, it mentioned setting a limit on the Ukrainian armed forces in the future. A limit of 600,000 troops in the first draft of the peace plan.
Efectivos en el primer borrador del plan de paz. Esa segunda versión.
In that second version, that limit went up from 600,000 to 800,000. Both are unacceptable to Russia, by the way. But these warhawks, like this lady, don't want either of those, neither 600,000 nor 800,000. They don't want anything. They want Ukrainian armed forces without any kind of restrictions, indefinite, and at war, indefinitely. And they don't even want Ukraine's neutrality regarding NATO, which is why the war began. They basically don't want anything. They want destruction. Well, in relation to this lady answered a question.
Respondió a una pregunta esta señora. No, en realidad no solo las fuerzas armadas.
No, actually, not just the armed forces. A potential peace agreement shouldn't set a limit on the Ukrainian armed forces, but rather should set a limit on the Russian armed forces. This lady, until recently, the prime minister of what some describe as a city country, of course, because her country has a population of 2 million people, less than a district of a large city. I, a native of Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires with 15 million inhabitants. The city of Buenos Aires is larger, 7 times larger than this lady's country. And this lady here, as a member, a representative of the European Union's foreign relations, comes from such a small country.
Representante de las relaciones exteriores de la Unión Europea, proveniente de un país así chiquito. Bueno, San Pablo, Ciudad de México, más grandes todavía.
Well, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, even bigger, several times bigger. That city alone is the size of this lady's entire country. And by the way, this lady left her position as Prime Minister of her country simply to take on this job, which means she doesn't care much for her country. For her, being the European Union's Foreign Affairs Secretary is more important than holding the highest office possible for a citizen of her country, Estonia. Well, clearly, this is more important to her than her own country, so she must not care much for it.
Su propio país, evidentemente, así que mucho no debe querer a su país. Pero bueno, después de este delirio de no, vamos a...
Anyway, after this delusion of we're not going to set a limit on the Russian armed forces, she, coming from a country of 2 million inhabitants, the European Union, which is pitiful militarily, is going to set a limit on the Russian armed forces after Russia's victory over all of NATO, as if they were the ones winning, as if in this war, instead of Russia making advances every day, it were Ukraine or Europe making advances. And they want to set a limit on the Russian armed forces. It's as if Hitler, from the bunker before his suicide, before Germany's surrender, with Germany destroyed, in a fit of madness said, "Oh no, now I want to set the terms of the German victory," while bombs are falling on Berlin and the Red Army surrounds the bunker. That's the level of delusion, isn't it? Anyway, here we have more statements from yesterday. Pay attention to this lady's latest madness.
Atención a la última locura de esta señora. Esto ya fuera de...
This is completely out of scale now.
And defense industry support.
Europa realizará una contribución fundamental.
Europe will make a fundamental contribution to security guarantees for Ukraine, with training, money and military support. We are analyzing how to increase our military contribution to Ukraine, but the security guarantees we can offer do not change the fact that the danger here, the threat here, is Russia.
El peligro acá, la amenaza aquí, es Rusia.
In 100 years, Russia has attacked more than 19 countries.
En los últimos 100 años, Rusia ha atacado.
In the last 100 years, Russia has attacked and invaded more than 19 countries. Some of them it invaded 3 or 4 times. None of these countries had previously attacked Russia. That's why, in any peace agreement, we have to focus on how to obtain concessions from Russia and how to make them stop invading countries and trying to change borders forever. I've heard that. In the last 100 years, Russia invaded 19 countries, some 3 or 4 times. None had attacked Russia. Honestly, bewildered after hearing this, I desperately began to go through Russia's history over the past 100 years. Quite familiar to me, by the way. But maybe there was something unseen, something unknown. Well, no, nothing came up. Not 19, not 20, not 5, not 2, not even 1. In the end, I consulted both ChatGPT and DeepSeek, the major artificial intelligence platforms.
Grandes plataformas de inteligencia artificial. Aparecían ChatGPT y DeepSeek.
ChatGPT and DeepSeek appeared, the American and Chinese artificial intelligences. Thinking. They couldn't determine which were the 19 countries. Finally, they answered, no, Kaja Kallas did not determine the list of those 19 countries. Eventually, perhaps among those 19 attacked countries, there could appear, for example, Finland, Romania, or, well, all the countries in quotes, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Well, all the countries taken by the Nazis, occupied by the Nazis, on their way to Russia, before the Russian invasion. And of course, when Russia begins the defense of Russia, with 27 million Soviet dead, Russians and all the other nationalities within the Soviet Union, not only Russians, it carries out the reconquest of its own territories, and then of the countries occupied by the Nazis, up to the capture of Berlin.
Los nazis hasta la captura de Berlín. Quizás esa la invasión de estos países, de estos 19 países.
Maybe that's the invasion of those countries, those 19 countries, but not even 19. So what's going on? This lady who sides with the Nazis says that's the Russian invasion, the invasion of the countries occupied by the Nazis, and then of Nazi Germany. That's the invasion. And this idea that those countries hadn't attacked Russia, how so? The Nazis began the offensive, almost reached the conquest of Moscow. They wanted the elimination of all of Russia. No idea. Where are those 19 countries invaded, attacked by Russia? Well, stretching it, artificial intelligence at one point listed Chechnya as a possibility. Of course, an Islamist separatist movement began in Chechnya, even with some initial success, until Russia reconquered its own territory, but always within Russia.
Bueno, alguien podría retroceder, la primavera de Praga, sí.
Well, someone could bring up the Prague Spring. Yes, in the context of the Cold War, the uprisings in the Czech Republic. They wanted freedoms. Well, in the end, Soviet troops restored the previously existing order. Well, the invasion? That's a bit much. But anyway, 1. Debatable. 1, not 19. Besides, that was the Soviet Union, not Russia. Well...
Bueno. Rusia. Lo presento otra vez, porque esto...
I'm bringing it up again because this making things up, a delusion. In the last 100 years, Russia has attacked more than 19 countries.
Rusia atacó más de 19 países.
Some as many as 3 or 4 times.
Algunos 3.
Some 3 or 4 times.
Ninguno de estos países atacó a Rusia. Bueno, yo recorrería la historia.
None of these countries attacked Russia. Well, I would go through the history of Europe and the United States, the great allies of the European Union, to determine how many European or American attacks there have been in the last 100 years. And there you'll find more than 19, easily. Much more than 19. Invasions of all kinds, massacres, genocides, all sorts of atrocities. Them, the Americans and the core countries of Europe. In fact, why don't Africans want help from Russia against French colonialism, against British, Belgian, or even German colonialism? Because Russia never took part in the imperial division of the African continent.
Entonces, ¿qué invasiones? ¿Qué 19 invasiones? Todos locos.
So, what invasions? What 19 invasions? Everyone's crazy. Well, that's it for now. Powerful men and women. Let's wrap up this broadcast here. Please remember to help us with a thumbs up against censorship, against the permanent demonetization of the videos. Many thanks to Waldo Quijada. The strategy of fascism is to lie. Greetings. Yes, that's right, Waldo. That's right, dear Waldo. Thank you very much for the support. In just a little while... Oh, no. Sorry, no. Good old Adrian Zelaya is sick today. So he was going to do his show, but in the end, at the last minute, he had to drop out because the poor guy just couldn't handle the discomfort anymore. Nothing serious. He's just feeling unwell today. Tomorrow, as always, Fernando Moragon with his show at 11, and we like every Friday with Juan Antonio Aguilar. The talk with Juan Antonio Aguilar. I want his opinion. I'll want Juan Antonio's opinion on this tomorrow, and it's going to be, we're going to witness something big. The explosion of Hiroshima and Nagasaki will be nothing compared to how Juan Antonio will react with his historical knowledge about this outrageous statement about shut up wings. Anyway, we're not going to miss the chance to witness Juan Antonio's outrage tomorrow in front of this disgraceful person. Well, and tomorrow the talk as always. On Sunday. Oh, this Saturday. This Saturday, a very interesting talk with Nicolas Lantos. For me, one of the most insightful political analysts in Argentina about Milei and Latin American politics. Exclusively this Saturday, we'll have a talk with him at 9, and on Sunday, again, Fernando Moragon, as always. In the meantime, DMP Geopolítica's programming, as always. Demolidores and Demolidoras, thank you very much for joining us. Beatriz, dear, thank you very much for moderating, as always. Demolidores, we love you very much. A kiss and a hug, and see you tomorrow. Bye.
Un beso y un abrazo y hasta mañana. Chao.